Hello and welcome to the 14th in my series of CPD Coffee Times with me, Dr Tina Rae. Today we're going to focus on understanding issues of vicarious trauma when supporting those with mental health difficulties. And obviously at the time of recording, 3rd of July, I have to say that this is becoming increasingly concerning given the fact that many of us are having to nurture and support children and young people who have been extremely stressed during the lockdown period and as they now are potentially transitioning back into schools. So many of you will know me as a psychologist currently working with a fostering agency, Compass Fostering, and also in a range of SEMH, social, emotional, mental health schools and institutions, and also as a therapeutic supervisor for educational child psychologists and attachment workers working with our fostering agency. I'm also an author, and I have written prolifically now over the years for Nurture UK, my favourite charity. So you'll find many of my publications with them, and I'm really proud of the long association. I also write extensively for the wonderful Sarah Miles at Hinton House Publishers, so you'll probably be aware of some of the publications that I have written with her. And I'm going to mention one today, which is a direct result of trying to support people in schools, mainly teachers, TAs, ELSAs, as we navigate our way through this pandemic, and we have to ensure that we are fit for purpose emotionally ourselves in terms of supporting them. So this is really quite important, this session today, I think, from my perspective and for everyone who's listening, and I'm hoping that this will give you some pointers as to how to nurture and look after yourselves, as well as how to really spot the signs and symptoms of vicarious trauma as you go through this next period. So the key aims for today are to identify burnout, stress, compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, but also to really be quite kind of clear about how they actually differ from one another. To consider the impact on us as professionals working with children and young people with mental health difficulties, and increasingly those problems are increasing, I should say, given the fact that we are going through this current pandemic and children have had some very difficult contexts to contend with during this lockdown period. Also to help and support you, hopefully, in being able to identify signs of vicarious trauma in yourself, and then just giving you some pointers as what you can actually do, A, to prevent it, and B, to manage when this does occur for you. We know that there's a risk for all of us now in this current context of vicarious trauma, simply because we will be listening to some very difficult narratives from children and young people who've had some very difficult things to contend with during this last few months. And I think particularly those at the top end of the continuum who had pre-existing mental health difficulties prior to lockdown, there are going to be some very difficult narratives that we are going to have to contend with, listen, absorb, and try to support those children and young people through these really complex situations and emotional. The impact on them and on us is going to be pretty significant. And I think there is this what Hudden Stam calls this soul weariness that comes with caring. And it's really difficult because sometimes it can come crashing in on us when we go home at the end of the day and you're still worrying and you feel as though you've actually literally absorbed the other person's trauma and their experiences of trauma. So I think we need to be very clear that this is something that all of us are potentially at risk of to some extent at this current time. We know that working with young people with mental health difficulties is a high intensity profession, which is clearly why people like myself, psychologists, psychotherapists, etc., who are engaged in this kind of work do have ongoing support in terms of proper, adequate supervision. I think that many of the reasons why is because we're empathising with children and young people who've experienced trauma or self-harming, and the feelings of sort of helplessness, anger and fear that they're experiencing, very often we will be absorbing those as an element of transference that we need to work through and process, and also to ensure that we have the resilience factors necessary to manage that most effectively. And I think as well that at the moment, particularly at this current time during the pandemic, that members of our staff teams who our parents or have histories of childhood trauma themselves may be at particular risk for experiencing such reactions. So it's probably more important than ever that we're aware of those particular individuals on the staff team, and that, you know, additional aspects of resource and resource implications are there for them, in the sense that we are really watchfully waiting and ensuring that certain people do not have to engage with the most vulnerable children and young people at this time, if there is the potential there for them to be re-traumatized themselves, or if it will just trigger some of those past childhood traumas for them that maybe possibly they have not been able to work through to date. So in terms of actually working in a high intensity profession, we know that there is this element of burnout and physical or emotional exhaustion that we can experience, which is a result of long-term stress. So very often we talk about teachers being burnt out, which is, you know, fairly typical and has been for many years now. Then there's compassion fatigue, which is in essence a state of tension and a preoccupation with the individual or cumulative trauma of young people. So basically we become totally preoccupied with that cumulative trauma that that young person has experienced. Then there is vicarious trauma, which is the transformational change in that us as helpers in our inner experience as a direct result of responsibility for an empathic engagement with a traumatized child. And I think it's interesting because historically we've known that the nature of this work is stressful. If we're listening to these detailed descriptions of very painful, often horrific events, which will also involve us as helpers reenacting a survivor's early experience of trauma and betrayal with them. And this, you know, expressly comes from Palmer et al.'s research from 2001. There's no doubt that hearing and thinking about the stories one hears can continue well after the child, the client, the young person has left that therapeutic interaction or engagement with us. So historically, our therapists themselves, their reaction to client traumas have been regarded as either burnout or counter-transference. However, these days, this term vicarious trauma or vicarious traumatization is used to describe trauma reactions that therapists or those working at the high end of the continuum with children, young people, self-harmers, for example, that their trauma reactions are resulting from the exposure to clients' traumatic experiences. So very, very clear that there is a distinction here. And in essence, for us as helpers or carers, it's almost the sense that our coping mechanisms become overwhelmed, and that reduces our effectiveness as a caregiver. And I'm thinking, you know, a lot here about some of the foster carers that I've worked with over the years who have really become compassion fatigued, but also an element of vicarious trauma there for some of them, in the sense that they have experienced really, really high levels of exposure to the young person's traumatic early years. And this can leave us feeling helpless, less able to give that care and nurture that we need to give. And also for some of us, it can lead to this sense of detachment from others who are on the staff team, for example, who are not involved in the work that we're involved in. And this can become quite divisive and difficult to manage, given that, you know, there's almost becomes a sort of resentment that other people aren't having to experience this. But it also can cause a detachment from family and friends as well. So it impacts on every sphere of the helper's life, in essence. So what are the results of vicarious trauma? In essence, it contributes to that feeling of being burdened, overwhelmed and hopeless in the face of need and suffering. And I have to say, I was delivering some face-to-face training in the last week when one of the team members actually used the term "I feel overwhelmed" repeatedly, and it was in essence to do with this sense of feeling that she just couldn't actually cope or manage with the level of trauma that she was being faced with by the high-end students that she's exposed to on such a regular basis. So very much this sense of a real hopelessness, not being able to do anything in the face of such a level of need and suffering. What vicarious trauma also does is it tends to lead people to extend themselves beyond what is reasonable for their own well-being. And it's almost as if you lose your boundaries and you feel that, you've got to keep going, you've got to keep providing this support, even though it is actually in essence damaging to yourself. And in essence, it can also bring changes in what I would call spirituality, because it can deeply impact on the way people see the world and their deepest sense of meaning and hope. And it's losing that sense of meaning and hope that is really ultimately the real damage, I think, in this whole area of vicarious trauma. So vicarious trauma is a gradual process. It builds up, unfolds over time, which is why it's quite tricky to recognise, because it's almost as if we keep going and going and going and don't actually notice as this begins to build up. And it really is a cumulative effect of contact with survivors of violence, disaster or other trauma. So thinking about this and linking this to the current pandemic, you can see why we are far more at risk of this, given the narratives that some of us are listening to from our young people currently. And it happens because we really genuinely care and empathise. The caring communities have always been at risk of burnout. We've always been at risk of too much emotional labour, but this is something slightly different because it's on a bigger scale than previously, I feel. And we feel committed or responsible to help, and at times we cannot help, and that can reinforce our own sense of helplessness. So some of the common signs of vicarious trauma: difficulty managing your emotions, so flaring up, not actually being able to self-regulate, self-soothe, difficulty accepting or feeling okay about yourself, and making good, informed decisions which you've reflected upon, and also problems managing boundaries between yourself and others, so taking on too much responsibility, having difficulty leaving work at the end of the day and trying to step in and control almost other people's lives to give yourself a sense of autonomy too. Also, we may experience sleeping problems, nightmares, intrusive thoughts, memories and flashbacks, so symptoms almost akin to PTSD, hypervigilance, and a general anxiety, sense of anxiety, but also potential anxiety attacks. We may feel isolated, disconnected from those around us, both in the work context, as I said previously, and at home. We may choose or opt to engage in substance abuse, high-risk behaviours. We will see possibly changes in appetite and sex drive. Irritability and depression may be there too, alongside a level of cynicism or negativity and apathy about life and the world. So again, mirroring this sense of hopelessness. However, what we need to factor into our thinking, as usual, is that there is a continuum here. And clearly some of us are hugely resilient and we have a huge amount of resources in terms of other people supporting us and support networks and systems which support us in maintaining that resilience, and we are able to communicate and access effective supervision. But people who are most at risk are those who tend to avoid problems or difficult feelings, potentially blaming others for their own difficulties. They will withdraw when other things get hard or difficult for them. Those who are most at risk may also be those who themselves have experienced high levels of trauma. So there's a real risk factor here for them. And a lack of connection with a source of meaning, purpose and hope can also heighten risk, as can clearly stress in multiple areas of our lives. So again, I'm repeating this quote. There's a soul weariness that comes with this caring. But what's important to note is this: at other times, it comes crashing in, overtaking one with its vivid images of another's terror. Now, this is really, really important, because what I'm trying to say, I suppose, here is that at the top end of the continuum, those of us in the 1 or 2% who are really working with children who have significant mental health difficulties, this is our real risk here. There are times when it's going to come crashing in, and I really do feel that for some of us there's a potential for this at this current time. So in a nutshell, it's a process of change. It happens because we care about other people who've been hurt. We feel committed to them or responsible to help them. And over time, what that process of caring leads to is changes in our psychological, physical and spiritual well-being. And two key elements which make it different from burnout that it's cumulative over time, and this process of change is ongoing. Now, the important point to remember about this is that it's hopeful because it provides opportunities for us to recognise the impact of the work as it occurs and unfolds, and that impact on our lives, and to develop strategies to protect and care for ourselves. So this is why I think there is a hopeful message too here. So if you are doing this as part of a CPD coffee time with a smaller group of colleagues, even if you're doing it on your own, just to stop and pause for a minute now and take some time out, stop the slideshow and think about this. I want you to think about empathy as a concept here, and think about when you are identifying with the pain of people who've endured terrible things, what you bring their grief, fear, anger, despair into your own awareness and experience. That's what you're doing when you empathize with them. You're bringing it into your own awareness and experience. And I want you to just think about what sort of problems or people do you find it easy or difficult to empathize with? And what are some of the ways that caring about people who've been hurt actually affects you? And I think this is really good, important self-reflection activity, because sometimes we have to just step back and think about why we find it harder to actually engage with certain people. What is it about them? What are their qualities? What are their experiences? Is it something about them that's re-triggering something about us from our past? Why don't I like talking to that person? Why am I labeling them as needy? Why do I think they're attention seeking? Actually asking ourselves some quite difficult questions, but also thinking about some of the ways that caring about people who've been hurt actually affects you. What is it that you experience when you've been engaged, for example, in supporting a young person, and you've had a conversation for maybe half an hour, 40 minutes, and they've told you some really, really difficult stuff, some stuff that's been very painful for them. How has that affected you? Because I think all of us need to actually stop and reflect. This is about not just self-nurture. This is about identifying potential risk factors, identifying potential problems, and being able to continually reflect so that actually when we begin to experience some of these symptoms, we know how to ask and get help at the earliest opportunity. And you probably will have identified a few things here when you've empathized with people, and this has left you with symptoms similar to theirs in the sense that you are almost reliving them, re-experiencing them. So I just want to flag this up again. If you are someone who's experienced this kind of childhood trauma yourself, and you feel that this is re-triggering this stuff for you when you're coming back into school after lockdown, then you please talk about this with your management teams, talk about this with colleagues, and ensure that you are not exposing yourself in a way that could potentially damage you. In short, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue and burnout can negatively affect your work, your colleagues, the overall functioning of the organisation, your school context, for example, and the quality of assistance being provided to those you're working to help. So you will be less fit for purpose as a helper, as a carer. They influence the way you act and interact with people you love. And of course, ultimately that affects your family and friends. And clearly, where do we get, for most of us, our most nurture, our most support from? That support network, the connections that keep us well, that keep us motivated, that give us meaning, are in the home. So obviously we don't want this overspill into that context. So just to reinforce that the three terms, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue and burnout, are often used interchangeably. But today I think and hope that you will see that actually vicarious trauma is cumulative, it's over time, and I think this is really, really important to remember this. It is a very distinct difference between the three key terms here. And the problem is that most of them, they all, in my view, look a bit like PTSD. So it is really important that we factor this into our thinking. And this is because these symptoms of PTSD are pretty similar. If you look at this, feelings of fear, hopelessness, anger, rage, horror, sleep disturbances, changes in memory, difficulties in concentration, and difficulties in maintaining appropriate boundaries. So again, very big overlaps here. And further clarification of this, burnout is the state of emotional, mental and physical exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. Many teachers clearly have experienced this, which is why there's such a difficulty and a problem, and has been over the last 5 to 6 years, if not longer, in terms of retention and recruitment. And I think this is interesting. It can happen with any job, we know this, but the teaching profession and the caring professions are higher at risk of burnout. And compassion fatigue, in essence, is that feeling of really deep sympathy and sorrow that we feel for someone who's really stricken by suffering, misfortune, the after effects of trauma, accompanied by this really strong, passionate desire to alleviate the pain or remove the cause of that pain for them. And it's a problem for counsellors, and it really can limit their effectiveness over time. But I also now would say it's potentially a real problem for some of the teaching staff that I'm working with, who are responsible as mental health leads, as inclusion managers, as SENCOs, for actually supporting those children and young people as they return after school, who have experienced a huge range of trauma during this lockdown period. So before vicarious trauma comes what we call secondary trauma, which is the stress resulting from helping or wanting to help a traumatized or suffering person. So secondary trauma, and it can occur within any professional person working with victims of trauma, so any of these individuals clearly. So in essence, vicarious trauma, because it's cumulative, I think is much more serious than burnout or compassion fatigue. It's not direct trauma caused by second-hand exposure. It's accrual of exposure to other people's trauma. So over time, this has a far more serious effect. And I think this notion that it is leading us to extend ourselves beyond what is reasonable for our own well-being is the point I want to make from this slide. Please, please, please remember that the potential is there for all of us to do this, but actually to extend ourselves to such an extent is what is ultimately going to ensure that our mental health is compromised. So just to flag up, reinforce again, those at most at risk of vicarious trauma, for vicarious trauma, those avoiding problems, difficult feelings, blaming others for their difficulties, withdrawing when things get difficult, having experiences of trauma, lacking connections with a source of meaning, purpose or hope, and have stress in many areas of their lives. So I think at this point in time, you may want to be thinking about whether or not you yourself can identify these signs, which is why I reinforce them, in yourself, in other members of your staff team, because I think ultimately, if we're going to really find the right kind of support systems and structures and build those within our staff teams, then we need to all be very, very conscious and aware of these signs and signals, and also be very aware of ourselves if we're potentially more at risk, or other members of our staff team. And what I would suggest you might want to do is use the stress and burnout questionnaire. Again, if you want to stop the presentation at this point in time and just take a look at this, if you can download it, I put the link here on this slide. And it's a brief checklist, but it's been designed to help you assess for yourself important ways to prevent this level of burnout or vicarious trauma ultimately. And it's very, very straightforward, very easy to use, and it may be something that as a team, potentially you may think, well, actually, why don't we all do this as we're coming back into school during this post-lockdown period, in order to just flag up for ourselves if we're potentially at risk, so we can put systems in place immediately, or for other members of the team, or for us as a group of professionals who are planning to support our children and young people. So my next slide, then what, basically, if you find that there is a problem, I think this is really, really useful, some strategies to manage vicarious trauma as suggested by Sark-Whitney et al. And there are 3 elements here: anticipating the vicarious trauma and protecting yourself, addressing specific signs of vicarious trauma, and stage 3, transforming the pain of that vicarious trauma. And in essence, he talks about self-care. And I think that this is really, really important. What does it mean to you? Taking some time to reflect and discuss this. Because if we're going to anticipate vicarious trauma and protect ourselves, then we need to think about arranging things ahead of time to anticipate the stress of our work and its impact. And the strategies that we might use there are about being aware, ensuring balance, and ensuring connection. We know that a sense of balance is considered to be one of the key components to preserving a sense of identity and overall well-being. So a healthy balance of work, rest and play, including socialisation with friends, which at this current time is possibly socially distanced in our gardens or via Zoom meetings, the internet, etc. It's important, that connection, for decreasing the effects of vicarious trauma. So we are more at risk potentially because we have less opportunity possibly to make those connections, to have those physical hugs, etc. Furthermore, any activities which assist the individual personal tolerance levels, for example, journal writing, personal counselling, emotional support from partners, will assist us to really begin to reconnect to emotions. And that is one of the obvious symptoms, is that we aren't doing that if we have vicarious trauma. So anticipating, protecting ourselves here, self-care, engaging in self-care. Addressing signs of it. If we recognise these signs in ourselves, then clearly we have to think about self-care, what we're doing on a daily basis to nurture ourselves, and also opportunities to simply escape, go and do other things. And I am going to do a session on flow from positive psychology, so hopefully that will be one element of this self-care that we can think about. The transformation of the pain of vicarious trauma includes the things that we do to transform the negative impact of the work into a connection with some positive aspects of meaning and community. So it actually includes creating meaning, infusing meaning in current activities, challenging our negative beliefs, and participating in community building. So things that we can actively do to transform that pain of vicarious trauma. So I think that something about challenging our negative automatic thinking has to be central to this. So at this point, I want you to think and discuss this whole notion of self-care and what it really means to you. Stop the show clearly at this point and spend some time actually considering what elements of self-care would really work for you, how you can ensure higher levels of connection, how you can ensure self-nurturing, escape, how you can challenge your negative beliefs, and how you can participate in that sense of community building, doing things for others that actually takes us out of ourselves. Self-care should really address the whole person. It's not simply about going to a spa and pampering yourself. It's really about thinking about your physical needs, emotional needs, behavioural needs, spiritual needs, and also includes stress-reducing activities which you would regularly and habitually engage in. And I have to reinforce the fact that self-care is not selfish. It's an absolute essential that we look after ourselves if we are going to be fit for purpose to look after children and young people, particularly at this time. And I'd encourage you to develop your own personalised self-care plan that fits in with your lifestyle, your personality. We're not all the same. And some of us will need to do different things, clearly. And that's absolutely fine. We have different resources and we have different interests. And if we link it to those and we make it personalised, then it's much more likely to work effectively. And key elements to self-care from my perspective, which would help to avoid or mediate some of the symptoms of vicarious trauma, are that we need to know our own triggers and warning signs. So this notion of being a self-reflective practitioner is an absolute essential, and it's key to this. We have to be alert to what we expose ourselves to also outside of the work context, that we are not exposing ourselves to further triggers, further levels of vicarious trauma through our interactions with people who perhaps should be seeking support elsewhere. So we need to be able to set clear boundaries, and boundaries are actually really essential, and many of us in the caring professions find it quite difficult to say no. So we need to reflect sometimes on the level and extent to which our boundaries are effective. We need to add variety to our work, so it's not the same old, so that there's a level of flexibility that we're developing. We need to invest in the relationships that we have outside of the work context as well, that nurture and support us, and build self-care into our daily routines, but not just at home, also into the work context. So some of those issues around how busy we're going to be when we go back and all the different rules and regulations, etc., after lockdown, very essential that what we factor into that is that we will be slightly slower, and that I think everyone will need to take more time to have more pauses during a school day, for example. So what do we do with burnout? I think it's the easiest one to address in essence, which is why we get holidays from work. So I would always ask people to think about and use the 3R approach. So recognise, watch out for the warning signs of burnout, which we have made explicit in this presentation here. Reverse, undo the damage by managing stress and seeking support at the earliest opportunity. Please, this is the potential for going into vicarious trauma if we don't address this early enough. So it's about actually taking a preventative approach. And resilience, building that resilience within ourselves by really taking care of our physical and emotional health. So totally being proactive. So using those 3 R's, recognize, reverse, and resilience. Basic coping strategies here: escape, getting away from it all, physically or mentally, whether that's books, films, taking a week off, playing a video, computer games, whatever it is, just talking about anything other than work is really important. That notion that we can just get away. So even if it's walking the dog, going out for that 30-minute walk in the morning at 7 a.m, whatever you want to do, it actually helps to just get out and escape. Rest, having a no goal or timeline, doing things you find relaxing. So it doesn't matter what that is, whether it's just sitting in the garden with a cup of tea, not feeling guilty about this. We need to recharge. We mustn't let our batteries go flat. And also playing. Adults, you know, we're still kids. We need to play. We need to get out there and engage in things that make us laugh, lighten our mood, just being silly sometimes, being creative, being physically active, whatever it is, playing is a key coping strategy. In addition to that, coping strategies, remind yourself of the importance and value of humanitarian work. One of the things that's come out of this pandemic for me, with so much passion, I think I've met so many lovely people who are really committed to going out there and doing things for other people at this time, and to some extent I've seen so much goodness, kindness, empathy. I really hope that continues. I think you know, I'm an optimist. I think that there'll be a level of this which will potentially, and I think that's really, really important, actually doing things for other people. Positive psychology, we know this really does make us feel better and healthier. Doing good makes you feel good. Staying connected with family, friends and colleagues is an absolute essential. That level of connection, feeling that we are getting meaning from those relationships, and also noticing, being mindful, noticing and deliberately paying attention to those little things that really aren't so little. So those small moments of quietness, the sound in the wind of the trees. I listen to the birds every day. I just stand out at my back garden. It's only a wee garden. It's just full of birds at this moment in time. So very, very important. Remind, stay, notice. They're tiny things, but they are essential coping strategies. Marking transitions, and again at this point in time, very, very, very important that we do that. These are really clear things that need to be identified, celebrated. We need to mourn those losses with people that we care about through the traditions, rituals, ceremonies that we would normally use, and maybe we'll be creating some new ones post-pandemic and during the pandemic. Also taking time to reflect, identifying and challenging some of our own cynical beliefs at time, and just taking note, wait a minute, stop, pause and think, do I really think that way? Is that really right? Is that really true? Is it just a thought? Is it just a feeling? And how accurate is that? And I need to challenge that potentially. And also undertaking what I would call growth promoting activities. So learning something new, writing in a journal, being creative or artistic or sporting, whatever it is, but doing something that promotes personal growth. So also taking care of ourselves through writing, journaling, meditation, telling our story, relaxation, exercise, play, educating ourselves. So when I'm talking about learning something new, I think the potential for this is enormous at this time, and it's really, really good. It's a good route to go down, to think I just want to learn one little thing new every day, whether it's, it's a tiny thing, just learning how to cook something differently. But dreaming and hoping as well, not losing our potential for that, and actually visioning what I would like the future to be and holding on to that vision and engaging in some of those musical creative activities. As I said earlier, the potential for self-care there is enormous. Being in nature, enjoying nature, growing things, absolutely essential. Also, obviously, our well-balanced diet. And needing to seek help. When we do, let's seek it, let's go and let's get that help and talk. And also just living that one day at a time. There's an awful lot at this current time we can't control, and that makes us feel stressed and nervous. And I am always saying to myself every morning, one of my key mantras is not live one day at a time. Actually, for me, what it is what is it I can control today? Let's focus on that. Let's actually focus on that, because there's so much that none of us can control at the moment. So, doing what you enjoy, saying no, keeping those boundaries, making art, talking, laughing, finding people who can actually listen and do listen, and just escaping into other things like movies, literature, art. Very, very important. Also, at this current time, I think when we're managing and thinking about managing our stress, which we all will be, use peer support. I did a session earlier in the series on peer group supervision, and I think this is really, really important that at this time we structure this in to our, not just our CPD, but into our regular means and systems of actually supporting each other in the learning context, in the school context, or in the workplace. Absolutely essential. Psychologists will frequently, on a regular basis, access individual and peer group supervision, and that's for a very good reason, because some of the work they do is very high risk. And I think this is really, really important at this point in time, that teachers, ELSAs, learning support assistants also factor this in and ensure that they are accessing appropriate peer support and supervision. And also as an individual, I think it's absolutely vital that if there is, that things are being triggered in you and there's unresolved trauma in your life, and this is being activated once again by your work, your interactions with the children and the young people, then please consider therapy, and please go and see your GP, talk this through and access what you need to access at this current point in time, rather than risk your own mental health. So what also helps us, and what we also need to do, and this is absolute key for ensuring that we can deal with and manage the sort of trauma that we're experiencing, is that we need to really increase the consistency and predictability of our work. And this has never been more important at a time when this is something so totally up in the air, and for many of us, we don't feel that we can do that. We don't think that things are predictable, but as much as we possibly can, we have to now think about this. How can we make what we're doing at work as consistent and predictable as possible? So I would say to you at this point in the presentation, if you're doing this as part of a group or you're doing this on your own, just to stop once again and pause and think about this really quite deeply. Think about all the different things that you can do currently to ensure that. What is it in the systems? What is it in the daily routines that you can do and others can do to ensure that what you're experiencing is consistency and predictability in your workplace and in your work? So bringing you back to this, very important. When we're doing this, when we're going back into school now, we must ensure that we understand these risk factors. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of these in great detail, but just to say, work style, work-life boundaries. You will know the people on your staff team. And you will know yourself if you find this difficult. Let's get help for that now. Let's talk to someone. Let's talk to the group. Let's talk for our peer group supervision processes in order to try and work this out and to actually ensure that we become better at this. And also think about the cultural styles of expressing distress and extending and receiving assistance, because this also we need to be factored into how we manage vicarious trauma for ourselves and those within our work context, because culturally some members of our team will experience distress and also will find it difficult or different in terms of actually receiving assistance. So we need to actually factor that into our thinking too. So in essence, vicarious trauma results in us having overactivated nervous systems, and what we have to think about essentially is how we can possibly reduce that, and we can actually manage our nervous systems more effectively in terms of engaging in appropriate self-soothing and self-regulation activities. So 3 key elements to this self-regulation: developing your effective action plan. How can you escape? How can you rest? And how can you play? What I'd like you to do at this point, if you can, stop the presentation again and just put those 3 key headings down on a piece of paper and jot underneath each one: escape, rest and play, all the different things that you can do, and talk about this together. Share your ideas, but obviously they're going to be personal to you, which is why it's important you develop your own self-care plan. It is personalized to you. And next, think about self-care under these 3 headings. So these are the tools I said earlier of transforming helplessness. Awareness, so being attuned to yourself. Mindfulness and acceptance, keeping mind and body in the same place. Balance, so getting that professional, personal, rest, work, play balance. Connection to yourself and others and something larger, because that decreases isolation. It increases our sense of self-worth, validation and hope. So again, write down those 3 headings, and underneath each one, write down what you currently do and what you perhaps need to do more of in order to increase awareness, balance and connection. So when we're thinking about self-care, just some final questions about self-care for you here on this part of the presentation. Very important sometimes. Why do you do this work? Why do you do it? What is it that's led you to this work? And how do you measure your success? What is it that you control in this whole process? And what are the costs and rewards of this work, this wonderful work that we do? And I would suggest, we go into this work because we absolutely love being connected to other human beings. What is it that you feel are the costs and rewards of this work, and how are you personally changing in order to meet the demands and stay well yourself, particularly at this crucial time? And once again, you may want to stop the presentation if you're with a group or even on your own and just think about how you would answer those questions. Very important reflection points. And just to flag up a useful resource for us all at this time, because I think this is a time when all of us need to engage in self-care, and we need to make sure that we are connected with others, that we engage in post-traumatic growth by that connection, through those connections, through engaging in self-care and self-soothing activities, which can really build us up and help to build up our level of resilience so that we can continue to do the work that we do. So I'm flagging up this toolbox for wellbeing, because this little book, and it's a small book meant to be popped into your bag and read on the train potentially, but it's full of helpful strategies and activities, both for the children, teenagers and for us as their carers, teachers, professionals who are nurturing them. So I'm really hoping that this will become a seminal resource from this time. I've written it during the period of lockdown as a direct result of listening to colleagues, teachers, parents, carers who are all discussing the need to engage in self-care. So in essence, this is a wee book full of easy to use activities, evidence-based, and I think it can be used by all parents, carers, teachers and others who are doing what we do, which is being concerned about supporting the emotional, mental well-being of children, young people. And I think this is really, really important at this time of uncertainty and fear, when we are potentially all of us more at risk of burnout and potential vicarious trauma. So it's full of user-friendly, easy to understand, evidence-based strategies. And again, as a psychologist working in the community with a range of different client groups, I've always felt it's hugely important that we make psychology accessible. So this is written in language that's easy to use, it's not full of references, etc., etc. It's basically a whole wealth, I think, in this little book of simple activities that you can easily use to self-regulate yourself and to teach children, young people how to do likewise. And I think that's vital too, because we know unregulated, dysregulated adults cannot possibly help to unregulate children and young people who are dysregulated. We know this, okay? We need to have our own regulation intact. We need to be self-regulated. So important at this time. So clearly set out under the 3 key trauma recovery approaches. I call it self-regulate for well-being, get moving mentally and physically, and connect for well-being. So it really does mirror everything that I've been talking about today in terms of self-care strategies in this particular CPD coffee time session. So I'm just leaving you with this thought, basically. Make your prevention plan now. Look at those 3 key headings, and underneath, again, write down all the different things that you potentially can do, might do, or are doing now, and think about your plan. How can you prevent yourself from increasing levels of stress and anxiety to the extent that you are at risk of vicarious trauma? How can you prevent this from happening? And how can you support each other also to prevent that from happening for each other, within each other? So making that plan is a key essential. And if you do nothing else as a direct result of listening to this session today, then make a self-care plan, I'll be really, really happy, because potentially we're all more at risk now, and it's an absolute essential, I think, that we really look after ourselves. Self-care is not selfish, so I'll just leave you with that thought. So once again, thank you very much for listening to this CPD coffee time, and I'm hoping it's been useful and it's been perhaps provided you with some practical ways forward in terms of looking after yourselves at this time. And I hope that you'll join me in the next one, which I will put onto YouTube the following week. Thanks. Bye bye.